This is the AAPOR Heritage Committee interview with Phil Meyer, Professor Emeritus at the University of North Carolina and former AAPOR President and AAPOR Award winner. I'm Kathy Frankovic, and this is March the 8th, 2013. Thank you, Phil. Thanks for being here and doing this. The
My pleasure. Thank you, Kathy, for getting the idea.
Well, the AAPOR Heritage Committee is charged with getting a visual and oral history of the organization from its most prominent members, and that's why I'm here. We're going to talk a little about you, but we're also going to talk about your relationship with AAPOR. Mm-hmm. So let's start with your first appearance at an AAPOR conference, your first introduction to the organization.
As an attendee.
As an attendee.
Yeah. Well, it was the result of a series of accidents. The first accident was I based my application for a Nieman Fellowship on my desire to learn about public opinion research. This was prompted by a couple of disasters when I was reporting for the African Beacon Journal from Washington and trying to do a seat of the pants poll traveling around Ohio with the political writer. And we predicted a couple of elections, 2 elections in a row, seriously wrong. And so the basis for my Nieman application was, you got to help me. I'm doing something wrong here and I don't know what. And Harvard likes to see itself as shedding light on out-of-the-way places like Ohio. And I got in. And in preparation for that, I read, by accident, I read the book that was inspired by Ithiel de Sola Poole's work, who was at MIT at that time. It was by Eugene Burdick, and it was called The 480. And it was based on Poole's work for John F. Kennedy in the 1960 election, where he used a simulation model based on several years of Gallup poll data to help plan Kennedy's strategy. And it was based on assumptions about what voters in each of these 480 categories would do. They were actually collapsed to a smaller number of categories for the model. But I thought that was really clever, and I thought, political campaigning is getting to the point where journalists can't understand it. So if I'm going to cover a political campaign in the future, I got to know this stuff. And that was part of my pitch to Harvard, too. So it was that kind of curiosity and the stuff that I happened to read that got me into Harvard. And then about halfway through the first semester, I was listening to a lecture by a non-tenured professor named Chad Gordon. And it was the introductory course in social science research methods. I had a master's degree from Carolina when I went there, and I was pretty full of myself. And I thought I can start right out in graduate seminars. But being a reporter, I had to go and interview faculty first to see if they were the right content for me. And the first faculty I went to was the one who taught the graduate seminar in social science research methods, a really nice guy named David Armour. And it only took about 5 minutes of conversation to realize that I wasn't ready for his seminar. And he sent me to the course that was for sophomores and juniors so they would have the methodology to do their senior theses. And it was a perfect fit. And listening to Chad Gordon's lecture, I thought this was really cool stuff. And my next thought was, I could do this. This is stuff a reporter could do. You don't have to write about what social scientists are doing. You can do the same stuff they do. And so that changed my focus through the rest of the year. And in the second semester, I did take the graduate seminar. I took one in the government department taught by a really smart young guy, H.D. Price, who had been V.O. Key's pupil at Harvard. And that was my second connection to once we moved to V.O. Key, because my professor at Chapel Hill had assisted him in writing one of his books. It was called A Two-Party South. Alexander Hurd was his name. He later left to become chancellor at Vanderbilt. So I had those indirect connections with the idea and Harvard. And so toward the end of the semester, Doug Price handed me an AAPOR program. It had just come in the mail. And he said, look at what these crazy pollsters are doing. And I saw that the conference was going to be within a reasonable distance. It was at the Sagamore Hotel in Bolton Landing, New York. And so I scraped the bottom of our cash reserve and bought a plane ticket to, gosh, where did I fly to?
Was it in Albany?
It was Albany, yeah. And then rented a car and drove up to Lake George, to Bolton Landing. And that was how I found out about AAPOR. I walked into the room at the opening dinner and looked for an empty seat. And there was a chair at a table that was being presided over by Bud Roper. And he invited me in and explained the culture of AAPOR. It was very family friendly, he said, and he had little kids there and a sheepdog that kept bounding through the halls, and that was fun. And Leo Bogart gave the presidential address. I had met him before because he was one of the speakers to the Neiman Fellows, and he wasn't too well regarded by the Neiman Fellows because he was identified with the business side, and the hostility between the business side and the news side was pretty strong in those days. But I was impressed by his PhD in sociology, and the talk I remember the most was by Oliver Quayle, who was doing innovative work advising politicians on their campaigns, and he made a big pitch for factor analysis to study and classify different kinds of voters. And I had just mastered factor analysis on using the Harvard Data Text program, which was a forerunner of SPSS. And it was written for the IBM 7090, which is a really impressive machine. It took up a room bigger than this. Its core memory was less than the memory in your cell phone, but you could get a lot out of it with lots of input-output operations. And to manage those, it had 10 tape drives, each one the size of a refrigerator, and that's why it took up so much space. And it was so much fun sitting there and watching it to respond to your program, because one tape drive would read the data and another one would read the Fortran, and then data text would translate the Fortran and so forth. And if they talked to each other in the right sequence, you knew your program was working. If it ended too soon, you knew you were getting an error message. And that was such fun. It made you feel so powerful.
So this is in the 1960s?
1966, 67.
Okay. Now, you don't get really heavily involved in the governance of AAPOR until significantly after that. And in the meantime, you are becoming the precision journalist.
Right. I got involved in the governance of AAPOR pretty much after I switched to academe. Although I think I did run for office when I was still with Knight Ridder. I think I ran for the Information Committee and lost. The second time I ran for that, I won. And I don't remember what year that was. I might have still been with Knight Ridder then. I know that when I switched to academe, Al Gillen said that was a pity because he perceived me as being on the upward ladder at AAPOR, and they had trouble getting qualified people from the commercial side. And there were too many academics running AAPOR, and they were hoping that I would rise as a commercial person.
But you were always engaged in AAPOR. I assume you went to most of the conferences between the time
Yes.
you first went.
The second one I went to, I remember very well because it was at Santa Barbara in California. And that was an election year, 1968. And I covered I think I covered part of the Kennedy campaign then. And let's see, who gave the presidential address then? Oh, gosh.
Doesn't matter.
It was a very famous survey researcher, a guy who had written the book about it. And I started bonding with AAPOR, I think, then.
So you go back, you leave journalism, you go to academia, you write precision journalism.
I wrote that while I was still a journalist.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then move to academia. And then come the 1980s and 1990s,
Mm-hmm.
you become much more closely engaged with AAPOR.
Right.
Do you think AAPOR had been doing a good job, a good enough job when it came to managing or handling journalists and handling the media's use of polls?
Well, there was a lot of conflict because people who did journalists were most interested in political polls, and that made them easily manipulated because a candidate would commission a poll, and then he would release selective results of it, and journalists would jump on that. They would say, "Oh boy, here's a poll. It must be true because it's scientific," but they didn't always realize that they were being fed stuff selectively. So that was part of it. And when AAPOR was working on the standards for disclosure, I lobbied for a standard that would require the polling organization to disclose what it hadn't disclosed. And I don't think that ever made it anywhere because that was too hard to organize and enforce.
And what do you mean by what they didn't disclose?
Well, the cure for selective revelation of the poll findings. In other words, they ought to release a complete report, or at least the data for secondary analysis. And that was going too far for that time.
Well, that seems to be recreated now in the Transparency Initiative, which
Yeah.
is an attempt to get public polls to release just that sort of information.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking really about a very slow process that's gone on for decades here to fundamentally get the same sort of information out there to the public.
And as the technology changes, the possibilities become more complicated, and the consequences of different kinds of information become more interesting.
Do you think that, let's talk about your presidency and the years of your presidency and your AAPOR presidential address, which basically attacked the media for the way it was reporting polls.
Yes, I hope I was modest about that because I was I was still in the media at the time, and but polling, precision journalism had been accepted enough that a lot of newspapers were doing their own polls, or commissioning polls with better understanding of what they were getting. But they were so shy about releasing results, they didn't fully trust it, this methodology. And so they would tend to release the results in ways that were unnecessarily ambiguous. The clearest example of that is failing to allocate the undecided. What I admired about Gallup at the time, and I think Harris too, was that they always allocated the undecided, so that for the final poll at least. So after the election, you could compare the poll with the election and see how far off they were. And most pollsters, and those done by newspapers, always reported the undecided and refused to allocate. They thought that was cheating, but it was really protecting themselves, because if you had 10% undecided, you could be 10% off on the winner and say, well, all the undecided must have gone for the other guy. And that wasn't fair. So I nagged them about that. And then the whole business of what to disclose was very much on the agenda during my presidency. And the one that I fought for the most was having an enforceable code. And AAPOR's system, at its most powerful, and it might have peaked about then, its form of discipline was the one that journalists like the best, simply public exposure, transparency. If somebody doesn't obey the code, make that known to the public. And of course, to do that, you have to have a formal procedure that allows the offender to defend himself. And AAPOR spent a lot of time working on that. And it was such a good job that I later used AAPOR as a model in trying to persuade media organizations in developing their own codes to make them enforceable.
We should underscore that you were president of AAPOR between 1989 and 1990.
Right.
So we're talking about, 23 years ago. And but again, these problems seem very, very current. And
yeah. One of the main differences between then and now is that newspapers were very powerful. They had near monopolies in most of their markets, and they made money whether they did good journalism or bad. And all that has changed now, of course. And we have a much more complicated media system than we did back then.
Yes, yes. Let's talk about let's talk about the sort of, I guess, where we are today and where AAPOR is today. Do you think that there has been improvement in media standards for polling?
I think so, because you can at least, I spent about 12 years consulting for USA Today from the late 80s to the early, to the turn of the century. And one of my achievements there was to get them to use what we called a nerd box, which is a little box with the methodological detail that only nerds in the audience would read, but you published as a matter of duty. And they did that for a while. And that became fairly common in newspapers for a while. I don't see it so much anymore. But that met the basic requirements from disclosure that AAPOR had set. And so that became a relatively common practice.